I think the challenging profiles are the perfect profiles. So when seemingly there's nothing wrong, right? So you get the perfect mushroom, and that there's all the perfect creative, and between 25 and 35% in the reactive somewhere. There's no shadows, there's no denial. It's all perfect. And that's difficult, right? So then the real listening starts because there's not much to tell.
Some debriefs are challenging because you don't know where to start with it because there's so much going on with it, and so there's so many patterns. Where do you focus in on what's going to have the biggest impact? Because if you don't, they're going to be overwhelmed by the level of data. I often find the harder ones being generalized and massively reactive and not very creative, and people feeling utterly devastated by it because that's not how they view themselves.
I had one individual that really got me scratching my head because she scored one of the highest leadership effectiveness scores, 98, I think, that I've ever seen. And yet, so her perception of herself was below 30%. So I knew straight away there was some imposter syndrome going on. But then when I looked deeper into the profile, I have my own key code now. So I have 4 levels that I measure on. It's mild, serious, severe, and extreme. So mild is, just above 20% distortion between the individual and the collective respondents. Serious is at 50, severe is at 70, and extreme is above 70. And most people are going to have between 10 and 15 out of those 28 subdimensions. She had 28 out of 29 distortions, 20 of which were serious or above.
So when there's a huge difference between their self-perception and others' perception, they're the ones that I find hardest because I'm quite empathetic. So I feel their pain.
People very often are able to surprise me, let's say. And this is what I find really fascinating about the debriefs. And so, of course, when you prepare for a debrief, you read the comments and you look at the graph, you have certain ideas, let's say, of the type of leader that you will be talking to. And what I love is when actually you're very surprised for the person that is actually on the other side. And it's very different from what you would have expected.
We have to find out what people were expecting, or if we talk about their biography or their successes or experiences, what can they tell us? Or what are the leaders that they admire, and how do they try to emulate him in their leadership, right? To sort of start to feel somewhere where there is a doubt in the way that this individual operates and how she feels about that.
So they'll see their profile and they'll see, I thought I was like this, people see me like that. Oh my goodness, what on earth? Am I in the wrong job? Am I completely incapable? Should I be in a different company? What's going on here?
So I was like, wow, this individual really doesn't know themselves. And yet the warmest, kindest individual that I had the pleasure of working with. And so what we did was go back and analyze her context, or her story, as I call it. So understanding some of the experiences that she experienced growing up, or anything that maybe scarred her. And it was fascinating. We discovered when she was about 7, 8 years old, and she was asked to stand up and present. We're talking back in the late 70s. So not only was she ridiculed by the class, but she was ridiculed by the teacher as well. And that had a monumental scarring effect for the rest of her life. And so what had happened was that she was always trying to make up for this experience that she'd had, that she wasn't good enough, and that she was trying to avoid being ridiculed. And that explained that the severe distortion in many of these subdimensions, as well as the blind spots that I guess over time she would just sort of hide away from it. So what was a wonderful ending to this is, by revealing what was going on, she was able to finally come to terms with that experience because it had dropped into her subconscious, come to terms with it, let it go, and then allow her to evolve as a leader as a result.
I think that for me, the biggest learning is really to try, yes, of course, to prepare, to look at the data, to look at the comments, but then be prepared to be surprised and not have pre-concept, because if you walk into a debrief with pre-concept about, okay, this is going to be like a very protecting or very distant leader, I already walk into the debrief that I'm actually probably protecting myself. Because that's like, for me, I'm talking about protecting and distance, because this is probably one of the profiles that for me is more challenging to, let's say, to interact with, because it's something that is quite, let's say, distant from how I am.
I can remember one person who was like this, who interestingly has become a really good friend of mine since then. And I started working with him. He was running marketing at the time and was felt quite isolated, had a background of really wanting to perform and please his dad and be the very best, and grew up in that kind of culture and that kind of environment where dad says jump, he says how high, and then he brought that to his new role as the head of marketing, and he basically isolated himself by trying to prove himself all the time to everybody. So he got way too sucked into the detail. He got way too into conversations, checking that everybody liked him. He got way too avoiding of conflict. And so everything was just kind of massively reactive on his profile. So we had a number of conversations, and it was luckily enough over the period of a couple of years to have conversations with him, partly with his leadership team, partly with him individually, to unpack where is this all coming from, why is he showing up like this, and what do people actually want to see from him, and how does he want to be? And he, about a month ago, he showed me his new profile, and it was just like massively creative. It was so wonderful to see, because he'd really owned it. So it was really hard for me to give him that feedback, because I could see how devastated he was, but it was also hugely rewarding to then, a couple of years down the line, to work with him again, to see, well, he's still doing that kind of role, so that hasn't changed. The only thing that's really changed is him. And it's just great to see that he's owned it to that level.
The most challenging one was actually one that was completely stable. Everything was 60%, but both in the creative and in the reactive. So it was just a green disc. And they also had pretty much the same to say about that as their raters. I really didn't know what to do with that. So I thought, you're perfectly deleting yourself in your creative behavior, it's totally undermined. So what is this, right? I can't remember the leadership potential utilization and effectiveness, but it came out in the conversation. Ultimately, it's in the conversation or the quality of our listening that we can find something, and moving from the cognitive to the heart, right? So we get a lot of stories and then we move toward, and so how did that feel for you, right? What happened? Right. And that's difficult. And it also takes some time to make space for people to get to know you, to build up the trust, to talk about seemingly informal things about life. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your early career. Who were the people who inspired you? Questions like that. And sometimes people go very fast. After 45 minutes, you are having a real conversation. And sometimes it takes coaching sessions before people feel safe enough to open up and to start really telling you, yes, this is how I feel. This was my darkest hour. These are my fears. Here's my doubt.
My learning is try to really go in like as a, without pre-concept. I'm not saying that I'm always able to do it, but when you are, then I think there are no really challenging profiles. I mean, there are people, of course, that are in challenging situations for a variety of reasons. But most of the times, I would say almost always, I found people that were maybe reluctant at first, but then really willing to, okay, let's see, what is this telling me? And what is maybe not everything that I'm seeing I like. Many times I don't like much of what I see. Maybe I'm not willing to work on all, but there's always at least something that I'm learning about myself there. And so I think that also the most challenging profiles can always be a starting point for development when they're open enough to really work on themselves.
Entering into those moments of vulnerability is, of course, the door to possibilities, right? So, because doubt is a real superpower, right? If we dare to own it, it's a process.